Thank you. It's really nice to see. Is this better? Is this better? Okay. Usually I'm quite good with holding the mic, but when it's not at my height, it's a bit difficult. You know, Charlie's question about the work on partition that I did, let me just explain to you that partition is a big, big historical event in South Asia, but particularly India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the three countries that were most directly impacted by the division of the country in 1947. But oddly enough, it's an event that is, for as long as I remembered it, it was something we studied in school or at university, and we only ever studied the politics of it in terms of the grand narratives of politics. So we heard about the way the leaders, Nehru, Gandhi, Jinnah, Mountbatten, Sardar Patel, everybody had fought, had differences of opinion. We heard about how political parties like the Congress and the Muslim League had battled over partition. The narrative in India was that the Congress, the Indian party, had never really wanted partition, that the Muslim League, which was then equated with Pakistan, were the ones who wanted it, and the Congress was forced into it. Of course, later, when you start looking at history, you learn something very different. And for me, too, really, the history of partition was limited to that, except that there was a difference, because my family are also partition refugees, and I grew up, like many people of my generation, listening to stories of partition inside families. So there was a discourse, a replaying of private memory inside homes, which was really very active, really very alive, but which found no articulation in the public world, and which, to people like me, who were its recipients and who are the first generation after partition, was just so much rubbish. In a sense, it was just old people's stories. So I would listen to my mother's stories of partition with one ear and they'd be out the other ear. I never paid them any attention. Until two things happened. In 1984, the first thing was Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, was killed by her Sikh bodyguards. And as a result, there was a huge kind of orgy of so-called revenge against the Sikhs all over India, but particularly in the city of Delhi where I lived. And to me, the city that I had grown up in, which had been, within quotes, a safe space from my privileged middle-class position, suddenly became a city that I could not any longer recognize. It became a city where violence lay so close beneath the surface that you could see it erupting in the streets at all times. Suddenly, from my position of middle-class privilege, I felt extremely vulnerable because my family is a Sikh family. And even though my father by that time did not wear a turban, but our name was Sikh, so we were very easily identifiable as Sikhs. The other thing that happened was, quite coincidentally, earlier in '84, I had begun work on a film on partition that two friends of mine were making, on which they wanted someone to research. And in theory, one of the directors of the film, who is a man called Satti Khanna, who now teaches at Duke University, I think he teaches film studies, Satti should have done the research and identified people to interview, but he hadn't had the time. So the camera person and director said to me, would you mind doing the research for us and traveling a bit in Punjab and finding people? So I started to look for people who had lived through partition, and suddenly I began to hear their stories in a way that I had never heard them before. And after 1984 happened and the city of Delhi collapsed, law and order collapsed in the city, there were citizens groups that formed to try and help people who had been impacted by the violence. I was part of one large citizens group called Nagrik Ekta Manch, which means Citizens Unity Group. And my job was in one of the areas called Shakarpur, which is just across the river in Delhi, to talk to Sikhs who had had to suffer violence and who had been displaced from their homes and who were now housed inside a school, and get their stories so that we could actually file for compensation claims and so on. And when they began to tell their stories, it was as if the memory of partition was just here. And almost every single one of them started to say, it's like partition again. We had never thought we'd face this in our own country. And that really shook me. And I began to realize that as somebody who thought of herself as, a secular, political, thinking, engaged Indian feminist, I had never paid attention to these stories. And how could I not have done? And I decided that if 3 days had done this to people, then what must have happened with those months of violence that people had faced? And I decided I would start working on this. And the first step that I took was to get a visa and travel to Pakistan, where my own family's other half being my mother's brother, stayed behind in 1947 in Pakistan. He later converted and became a Muslim. And he kept my grandmother with him, and for 40 years, nobody in the family had any contact with him. And if you know the geography of India and Pakistan, Lahore and Delhi are half an hour apart by air. And it takes about 6 hours or 8 hours to travel by road. But the distance that created by history was so great that there was complete lack of communication. My mother never got to know when her mother died. So my first step in beginning this research was to go to Pakistan and find my uncle. And after I found him, it sort of opened many doors for me, and I started to work on this subject in a random kind of way, but over years and years and years. And that's really what led me to this.
And what was it like for your uncle living in Lahore all these years, separated from his family? How did he acclimatize himself to becoming a Muslim and living in a Muslim country?
It was a very strange thing. My uncle chose to stay on in Pakistan. He was 20 at the time of partition. It was a very practical decision. He saw no prospects across the border in India. He had not had a university education. For various familial reasons, he had been pulled out of the university. So he felt that he was better off staying in a place that he knew and in the home that he knew. But he was intelligent enough to realize that if he let my grandmother go, the property was in her name. So he would have had to let the property go. So he kept her with him in order that he could retain control of my grandfather's house, which meant that my mother and her siblings on the Indian side of the border were not able to claim any compensatory property, which is because the understanding was if you left property there, you could get compensation on the other side, on both sides. So their resentment of him built up for that. He converted to Islam about a month or so later. He was in love with a Muslim girl, a neighbor, and he decided to marry her, and he converted because he thought it would be simplest to convert. He converted out of convenience, not conviction. And outwardly, he took on all the trappings of being a good Muslim, while inwardly, he continued to turn more and more Hindu every day. And it was a very strange thing. It came out in things like, he would root for the Indian cricket team when they were playing, and, weird things like that. One of the things he refused to do was he refused to learn Urdu. And as you probably know, Urdu became the official language. So he couldn't read road signs, he couldn't do anything like that. And he said he refused to learn it because it was the language of Pakistan. But his protests were limited to these things. And his wife, who saw the kind of thing that was happening to her husband in his head, for him, the notion of home, because, partition refugees carry with them this deep notion of the loss of home. In Punjabi, in Urdu, the word watan, those of us who know Punjabi and Urdu and Hindi will understand what that word, the evocativeness of that word, the sense of longing, the sense of belonging, the sense of loss, all of that. For my uncle, his watan was always India, and he had never been there in his life. He had visited India only once, very briefly. But because he was left behind in Pakistan, India became the thing he longed for. It became home. For my mother and her sisters, home was Pakistan. because that was the home they had grown up in. And this is what that historical process did to people, you know, created these kind of strange losses. So in a sense, he became more and more, he became a split person, externally one thing, internally the other thing, and his wife understood this very well. And she therefore decided to bring up their children as good Muslims. The daughters grew up in parda, they were never allowed outside or anything, because she didn't want their heads to be split in the way his was.
And what effect did partition have on your mother? And then can you lead to the reunification of your mother and the brother?
My mother never forgot the loss of her mother. You know, one of the things that affected her very deeply was the fact that she never knew when her mother actually died, and she never saw her again after 1947. And we always heard in the family this speculation that our grandmother had died maybe a year after partition, or maybe 2 years after partition, that she was actually unwell and she wouldn't have survived for very long. And it wasn't until I went in 1987 to visit my uncle that I learned that my grandmother had lived till 1956, which is 9 years after partition. And as I said, Lahore and Delhi are half an hour away. And I don't know, I just think, what must that woman have lived with? The silence in her head, just wondering about where her children had gone. Why was nobody ever contacting her? You know, what excuse did my uncle make? So for my mother, this was the thing that was most difficult to forgive. And I took her back to Pakistan, the third or fourth time that I went back after meeting my uncle, to attend the wedding of his youngest daughter. I took her and her older sister. And I have to tell you that the year before I took her there, I was going to see him, and she said to me once, and I'll say it in Urdu, and then I'll translate it into English. She said, "Usse पूछना, उसने मेरी माँ को जलाया था कि दफनाया था." So ask him if he buried my mother or cremated her. And I was really shocked, because my mom was a raging, strong, secular feminist. Much more so than me. She was out in the streets demonstrating all the time, jumping walls. You know, I used to feel embarrassed, thinking, my God, she's my mother, she should be a little more discreet. But, you know, didn't matter to her. She fought with everybody, and she was anytime ready to take up cudgels and all of that. And yet, there was this deep-rooted, you know, religious feeling. And I said to her, just, where did you get this from? Why are you asking this? And she said, no, you just ask him. And of course I asked him, and of course he had to bury her. And he never showed me her grave, which he just felt he didn't have the courage to do that. So she carried all this, you know, and yet it was wonderful for her to be reunited with her brother. When I took her back, they had not seen each other for 40 years. She was in her late 60s. No, she was not, he was... I can't remember what the age thing was, but anyway, there they were. Yes, they had not seen it. She was 17 years older than him or some such thing. So he was 60, she was 77, something like that. And they'd left each other as young people. So it was a strange kind of reunion at the airport. And then I decided to leave them alone and go and stay at a friend's house. And for 3 days, they kind of skirted each other, you know. They didn't know what to talk about. And then suddenly on the third day, he said, I'll take you to see your rooms. And he took my mother and her older sister, who I had taken, and they wandered around the house, and they retouched all the spaces that they'd lived in. And then they just cried and cried and cried. And then it was like wonderful. We acquired another family across the border. Then my mother was very proud to say that I have a Muslim brother.
And you have stories of many women in the book and what they experienced during partition. Maybe I'll get you to talk about, and if I'm pronouncing your name properly, Damayanti Sehgal, because you made her the first and the most prominent. And she's this delightful woman who visited your home. And what did partition do to her?
See, I think one of the revelations for me in the course of researching this book, and I'm ashamed to say it because I'm a feminist, I should have known better, but one of the revelations for me was what happened with women during partition. And I learned of it completely by accident. I learned of the fact of the mass rape of women, And I don't really know why it came as such a surprise to me, because in every battle, every process of violence like this, women are sexually assaulted, raped, so it should not have come as such a surprise, but it did. And I started to look at that, and in the process, I came across another reality, another story, and that was the story of the violence that families did to their own women, and particularly Sikh families, Hindu and Sikh families by and large, because when they feared that their women would be abducted, killed, attacked, raped, impregnated by men of the other religion, they chose to kill those women instead, calling these killings honor killings, as happens today in other contexts. And, these were some of the histories I discovered, and then came other stories. One of the women I met was this woman called Damayanti Sehgal, whose niece lives in England, and she's a writer. Her name is Leena Dhingra. And I was talking to Leena one day about the work I was doing, and she said to me, "Why don't you talk to my aunt? She lived through that time." So I called up her aunt and went to visit her and asked if I could interview her, and she said, "Yes, of course, but I'll come to your house and you can interview me there rather than you coming to my house." And this was quite unusual because in India, as you probably know, if somebody's older than you, they don't come to you, you go to them. There's just no question that they will come to your house. But she wanted to come because she said, it'll be fun. She said, "You'll have to give me a cup of coffee." So I gave her many cups of coffee. But she started to tell her story, and she was one of the women who had worked to rescue abducted women. After women were abducted on such a large scale, their families filed reports that they were missing. And both India and Pakistan, who were fighting over everything, including pens and paper and ink and arms and ammunition and trains and whatnot, sat down to agree on the fate of women quite early on. And they agreed that they would send out search parties to rescue women in each country, and these would be raped and abducted women, and these women would be brought back to their natural homes. I use natural within quotes, because the natural homes were identified with the religion of the woman. So what happened was that out of a sense of benevolence, no matter that the woman, a Muslim woman might have been a resident of India, but she was found in the company of a Hindu man, they would assume that she had been abducted and they would forcibly bring her back to India. And then they didn't know what to do with these women, so they housed them inside ashrams and so on and so forth. And for many women there, especially Hindu and Sikh women, their families didn't take them back because they thought the women were by now polluted and had had sex with Muslim men. So there was a whole undercurrent of a discussion about sexuality. Now, Damayanti, to go back to Charlie's question, because he asked me one question, I've wandered off someplace else.
That's okay.
Damayanti worked with these rescue teams. And she was an amazing woman who had traveled alone across the border to safety in India and had had a very, very hard time during that time, and then had been picked up by one of her aunts who asked her to help in the rescue and so on of these women. And although she was working on behalf of the Indian state, and there were a lot of women like her who enacted the Indian state's policies of rescue and rehabilitation, they actually flouted those at every stage. And out of sympathy and solidarity with the women they were working with, they would often go and do anti-state things and help the women. So many women, for example, refused to be rescued. Many said, "We don't want to go back. What are we going back to? We're going back to another forced marriage." Because after all, marriage for many women in India is like an abduction anyway. I mean, that's the logic they use, that you will give us to a strange man. Here we are with this man, he may be of a different religion. We've got children with him, he's looking after us. Whatever it is, he may be our rapist, he may be our abductor. We are not going away. And Damayanti often helped these women to exercise a very unusual sort of agency, because you wouldn't expect that choice to be a choice that a state agent would actually recognize. And her own family, which was a very wealthy family, not only did they never know what she had lived through, but they never asked her. This silence around these things is weird. And it was when she was in my house being interviewed by me and a friend of mine, that her sister, who was older than her, and Damayanti was then in her late 70s, so sister must have been 80 plus, had come along and was sitting in there, and she kept saying to Damayanti, but you never told us this. You never told us this. And Damayanti was saying, but you never listened, you never asked. And it's a strange way in which families wiped out histories of women. And I'll tell you another interesting detail. Damayanti Sehgal was the aunt of a very well-known Indian historian called Sharmila Thapar. And after my book was published, Sharmila, I met her somewhere, and she said to me, you know, I read your book and I cried at the account of Damayanti because she was my aunt. And she said, in the family, we always thought she was a loony. And when she told us about these stories, none of us listened because we thought she's just telling stories. And now when I read it, I realize what she lived through. And she said, I really regret not having talked to her. And Damayanti was dead by then. So there's so many of these, unfinished histories which are still...
Well, this is one of the things you point out in the book, that the word partition doesn't do justice to what happened. And maybe you could elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I think the whole question of language is very important. And that's one of the things that I came across in the course of my research. People had lived through such terrible kinds of violence. They had seen their neighbors, their friends, their lovers do such terrible things to them, to others that they loved and cared for, that when it came to describing that violence, they often did not have the vocabulary. Because there are no words that can describe, you can literally describe the violence. And the most symptomatic thing of that is partition. The word partition, I mean, what does it mean? A division. But even if you take that word in Hindi or in Urdu or in Punjabi, and you look at Batwara or you look at Taqsim, none of these captures actually the depth of what happened at that time. So in a sense, the inequality of language to describe what people lived through was something that at every stage of the research struck me in the book. And I was thinking that, in the West, for example, the biblical term Holocaust has been used, and in some ways that does allow you to imagine a different kind of experience, and that does allow you to possibly approximate to something that might be closer to the truth. But here we really don't have that language. I mean, even women who had lived through rape, they really did not have the words to describe what had happened, the violation that they had felt. Sometimes it was multiple rapes. And therefore, the sort of things I got was our honor was violated. The men did their work and went away. And then you have to second guess.
Well, you were able to get the stories out of the women who traditionally didn't tell their stories. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, for example, I talked, one of the things that as a feminist, I was very interested in looking at was the whole experience of rape and what had happened to women who had lived through that. And I went in, the research was a learning experience for me. I went in with this very simplistic assumption that there's a terrible silence about the question of rape. There always is in history. Here I am, a sensitive feminist, and I'm going to talk to women, and I'm going to uncover this experience of rape. I'm going to break the silence around it. And by breaking this silence, I will be liberating the women who have lived through it. I'm really now, when I look back, I'm really ashamed of the assumptions I carried with me into this research. And it was when I began talking to women that I realized how wrong I had been. And I realized that the historian, who wants to actually look at this question of silences around certain things has to ask himself or herself to whom their responsibility lies, to some abstract notion of historical truth, or in the case of a living history, to the people who are living that history and to their lives. Because many of the women I talked to told me their stories. But they asked me not to tell those stories or not to identify them with the stories, because many times their children did not know. And I tell the story in the book of a doctor that I spoke to who had been abducted and raped and then who was rescued and who now had a very successful practice in a city in Punjab. And when I went to talk to her, and the interesting thing was the community that had known her, they all knew her history. So in a sense, there wasn't a silence about it, but there was because they didn't talk about it very much to anybody. They talked to each other, but they were the ones who directed me to her. And when I went to talk to her, she said to me, look, I'll tell you my story, but I want to beg you not to use my name, not to let it be known, because my children don't know that I've lived through this, and I cannot bear for them to have this knowledge. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had to problematize this notion of silence. I had to look at some stories which I could not tell, but perhaps find another way of telling them, which was through my voice rather than their voice. And yet respect the silence they wanted me to keep. I mean, even with my uncle, sometimes the things he said to me were really terrible. And had I told them, it would have been very difficult for him to live the life that he was living in Pakistan. So I had to take a decision that these are things I will not talk about, but that I will talk about the difficulties that are there in breaking silence. And the breaking of a silence does not automatically lead to the liberating of a voice. It can actually create many other problems.
And how is Partition with us today in North America?
In North America, I think in actually very different ways. You know, there are 3 or 4 things that I see. First of all, I see because there are so many South Asian, Indian, Pakistani academics and young students in North America and Canada, and there is a renewed interest in partition. So there's a whole lot of really interesting research coming out. And going back to family archives to locate stories or to talk to older relatives and so on. I see that as a very interesting new sort of move. And someone was asking me a couple of days ago, why do you think it took so long for these stories to start emerging? And I think there are times in history when certain kinds of histories can emerge because there is a sort of a more hospitable environment, there is more of a spirit of inquiry, there are people who have now put the emotional trauma somewhere behind them and who can afford to listen. So I think all of those things are happening also in the diaspora. But there are other things as well. Indians and Pakistanis in the subcontinent rehearse their old enmities against each other and have a deep, while at the same time they have a deep desire to meet each other, to demystify each other, to travel to each other's countries. We cannot do that easily. In the diaspora, there are no such barriers. So while the old prejudices may carry through, but the friendships also can be quite strong and quite sustaining. But, of course, you saw Canada is the home of the Khalistan movement, and the Khalistan movement very much was linked to the kind of legacies that partition left behind of communal identities, of sectarian strife, of the kind of violence that we saw, and I think that's also there. I think also there are many, many stories here which have not yet been collected, and I myself was doing that this morning, talking to a family in Vancouver who are part of a story that I've been tracking for some years now. So there's also that kind of thing that's there. So I think there are many ways in which in the diaspora, different aspects of this history still carry on. Also, I don't think the enmities between India and Pakistan or Hindu and Muslim have entirely disappeared in the diaspora. You know, I'm saying there's one aspect of it is that these friendships are created, but I think these histories are also played out in very different ways.
Well, I could be selfish and keep asking questions all night long, but I think I should give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So if anybody has a question or you'd like to ask Urvashi, does anyone? Yes? The gentleman in the hat here. Oh, Suresh, would you like to go out with the microphone?
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your stories. I'm doing research on what grandparents and grandchildren learn from each other. And one of the project is writing stories of the grandmothers or grandfather. The challenge comes, as you said, it is difficult for grandparents to talk to their grandchildren. But at the same time, they do succeed in many respects. The issue comes, what do you do with the stories? Because they have, some of them are under 15 and some are under 25 who write it. And one of the suggestions is that if newspapers like Georgia Straight or would have a page called My Grandmother or My Grandfather and get the stories published. But I also think there is an element of crying. Because one of the grandchildren tell me that when we talk to grandparents, they start crying. So what should they do?
And that's a tough question. What should they do when they start crying?
That's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, I find when I'm talking to older people, and when they're crying, I'm crying too, a lot of the time. And I think the tears are in a way, an outlet and a relief for them. But I think just being there is important. If you are there, I don't think that in a situation like that, anyone can dictate what you can do. It has to come from you, from that equation, from that person, from that moment. So no matter what I tell you, it's not going to be the right thing. No matter what I say, it will never be the right thing for me in a situation like that, because the situation will tell me how I should behave at that time. I know this is not a sort of clear answer, but really I can't say more to you than that.
And I just want to ask you, is there a possibility to create an archive of these stories?
Yes, there's always a possibility. There are actually, if you look up the net, I don't have the URLs here, but there are a couple of people who have certainly created partition archives, and they're putting up oral histories up there. So, in fact, the story that I was chasing today came to me because someone who was trying to find out about his past had actually tried to look on that partition archive and didn't find it, and then he found a reference to me and he contacted me. So now when I get the complete story, I will send it to him and he'll be able to put it up there.
So a question up here. We'll just wait until Suresh can get the microphone up there. And your question for Urvashi?
Thank you very much. That was absolutely amazing. I wanted to ask you about Yasmin Saskia's work on the Bangladesh, the partition of Bangladesh. And so in that context, she talks about the healing that raped women have undergone. I was wondering about class. Do you think, and what is your understanding of the socioeconomic differences between the women and the people that you've looked at and people like Saskia look at? Because she's looking at a lot of women who are anonymous. I mean, they're known as, they're village women with, not to say that they don't have identity, but there is less, sort of the kind of middle-class bourgeois values that they have. That's the first thing. So I wondered about class in your analysis. And secondly, I wondered how you feel about, and I may be treading on a little bit of, Bangladesh, the partition, and 1947, particularly in view of Sharmila Bose and her controversial book. I have to bring that up. I can't go without asking you for your comment on Bose. Because, that's really led to, it's a can of worms opening up there, right? So do you think that, what are your views on
okay,
that?
Very quickly, I'll tell you about Sharmila Bose. I think Sharmila Bose's, I don't care much for Sharmila Bose's book. I think that she lost an opportunity because she had some really interesting material to look at the conflict in Bangladesh from many perspectives. I think she loses that. I think the book is, and I would rarely say this about a writer, but I will say it about her, it is full of a kind of hubris that I don't think any scholar should have. In the introduction, Sharmila Bose says, my book is unique, and it will forever remain unique because nobody will be able to do this kind of research, and nobody will have access to all the people that I've talked to, because by the time they get to them, they'll have died. I mean, I think this is a shocking thing for any scholar to say. So I have read that book from cover to cover. It made me furious. It made all my Pakistani friends furious, and it made all my Bangladeshi friends furious. So it's not a book that I'm really sorry. I would not usually be so critical about a book in public, but
It's
Yasmin
always fun to
Saikia's.
hear writers run down other writers.
No, it's not. It's not fair because a lot of. I mean, I'm a publisher. I see how hard people work to write their books. So I would hate to put them down. So that question was not answered as a publisher. That was answered. Yasmin Saikia's book is a different story. She does talk to the Biranganas, that is the women who were raped during the Bangladesh war, and she does talk to women across classes. Because one of the women she interviews at length is a woman called Priyobhashini Firdausi, who is the one who has spoken out quite a lot. And I like Yasmin's book very much. In fact, I had hoped to publish it. But recently I was talking to some Bangladeshi friends of mine, and they did have a problem with some aspects of it. And one of them was that in the interviews that and this goes back to something I was talking about, in the interviews she did with Firdausi, she used a lot of things that Firdausi said to her about her own family, which she possibly did not want out in the public, about relations with her sister-in-law and such like. And apparently Firdausi was very disturbed when the book came out. And I think this is really a question that researchers need to tackle when they're talking to living people. I raised this when I was talking about what you have responsibility to the person or to some abstract notion of truth. Because very often you're in a position of power when you're interviewing somebody, and even though you ask them, do you mind if I publish this? They will say yes. But it's when they see it in print, it's a totally different story. So as far as possible, one has to go back to the person and show them what you're going to write. Because really, print and conversation are two different things. I had this, my uncle also was, when I finally showed him my book, and for years, even though I had asked him that at every stage, can I write this, can I write this? And I exercised my judgment about what I wrote. But even then, when I didn't have the courage to show him the book for 3, 4, 5 years. And finally, when I did, and it was pure accident, I took it with me to his house, intending to show it to him. I didn't have the courage. I sat down on it. And when I was getting up to leave, he said to me, "Where's the book?" And I said, "No, I didn't bring it because, I forgot." And he said, "So what's that you're sitting on?" So I had to give it to him, And he read it, and he was very disturbed, and he rang a friend of mine and talked to her and said, "Why did she write all that?" Then my friend said to him, "Look, she wasn't judgmental about you. You read the book again, she's only written what her mother thought about you, which is what your sister thought about." He read it again, and then later he talked to me, and he was fine with it. Then he was very proud of it. But that's fortunate for me, because it could have been very, very hurtful, So I think that one has to sort of watch all of that. I forgot what your other question was, because I went into Bose and Saikia.
Okay.
So,
Are there other questions? I could ask. Oh, there's a question up here.
oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for reminding me.
You mentioned
Yes.
also the Dalit women in your book, the
Yes.
challenges
Yeah.
of...
Yeah. Class is central to my analysis in many ways. The people I have interviewed cut across a range of classes and castes. And also you find, when you look at the movement of people from Pakistan to India and India to Pakistan, it's a very classed movement. The rich went by air or by train or by car. The poor went on foot. And the poor were the most vulnerable. Although there was a wiping out of class in the abduction and sexual assault on women, and often it was the rich women who got picked up, because that was a way of revenging, taking account of class, when the poorer men would actually pick up the rich woman and take her away as their loot or their property or whatever. Plus, one of the interesting, fascinating things I found was the experience of Dalits. I was particularly interested in looking at the experience of minorities, for example, sexual minorities. I looked at hijras and what happened with them during partition. Dalits, I came across, and it was, again, I'm ashamed to say it, it was pure accident. I talked to a woman in a small place near Batala, and she was a sweeper in a college. And her name was Maya Rani, and I was interviewing her, and she said to me, my village, There was a rumor that it would go to Pakistan, and then there was a rumor that it would go to Hindustan. And every time we heard the rumor that it would go to Pakistan, my friends and I would, the Muslims would run away, and my friends and I would jump into their houses. We would steal everything and bring it away, and the reverse. And she pointed to her room where I was interviewing her, and she said, look around this room, you know, all those brass utensils, my jewelry, everything I got at the time of partition. My 6 friends and I, we made our dowries then. And I was really taken aback, and I said to her, but weren't you attacked, and weren't you the targets of violence? And she said, why would anyone attack us? We're not Hindu or Muslim, we're Dalit. And, you know, it was like, I don't know if you've read those Archie comics, which I used to read when I was a kid. When a light bulb goes off over your head and you think, my God, why didn't I think of that? And suddenly I thought, why did I not think of caste? And then I started to look for the Dalit story in the master narrative of the Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim story. And of course it was there. And there was such interesting dimensions to it, which I won't go into now because I could take forever. But one of the most interesting dimensions was that, like the Hindus and the Muslims, the Dalits had also made a demand for their own country. Because in Punjab, they were there in quite large numbers. And they were a politically strong force because Ambedkar was around at the time. And therefore, they demanded an Achyutistan, and they gave it a geography in the Punjab. They said this area. And really, you know, if the Hindus and the Muslims were making demands, why not other communities? So there's the whole question of class and caste is actually very much there.
Okay, and the question here on the left? Yes?
Yes. Hi, I'll try and keep it short. First of all, I wanted to say thank you. I read your book in one of my classes during my undergrad a few years ago, so it's a real pleasure to hear your experiences in person. And I just actually completed my master's thesis on violence against women in Vancouver South Asian community. And I just was struck because when I read your book, one thing that I got from it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is on both sides, it was also, you know, all the struggle that was going on during partition, but it was also the male dominance over women on both sides, on both religious sides. And to me, that's something that's still continuing today, not just the religious struggle, but, you know, within Hinduism, within Islam as well. So, you know, like there was that story recently about that girl in Assam who was, you know, dragged and raped in public because she was seen leaving a party. So, and there are all these issues of honor killings and everything. And I was just wondering if you see any connection between, to say it's patriarchy is very simplistic, but I think it is there. And I was wondering if you see any connection between what happened back then and what's going on now. So.
So are you saying that was there, if I was to put your question another way, was there anything specific or particular about the violence of that moment, or is there a continuum with the violence that...
Yes, I'm wondering about the continuity and why it's still going on. And do you think there's that undercurrent of the way women are treated in our culture?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. I mean, I think that there are many connections and there are many continuities, just as there are differences. But I believe that every society, because of the strong hold of patriarchy on all societies in the world, every society finds its level of violence towards its women. And the difference really is in the cultural forms that violence takes, and which come out of the cultures of those societies. So, as we all know, in a country like India, pretty much every religion, every cultural context diminishes women, despite the fact that, I mean, if you put this, you know, I often find myself talking about Indian women as people used to say in the old days, with forked tongue, because I believe very strongly that Indian women are doing some fantastic things in their lives. And yet there is no denying that they face really terrible violence. But they're doing these fantastic things against amazing odds. You know, the 1.2 million women who are in panchayats are really, I think, changing the face of poverty at the ground level. Nobody's taking account of it because they don't count that. But in putting in sanitation, putting in schools and all sorts of things, they are creating the conditions for the removal of poverty. And it's only the economists took account of that, they'd have a very different picture. But yet, there is culturally a very strong son preference. There is a belief that women don't count, that they can be put on a pedestal and worshipped, and then you can be violent towards them in the home and so on. So I think that continuity is very much there. But the forms of violence like mass rape, like abduction, like carving women's bodies with symbols of the other religion that happened at that moment were perhaps somewhat different from what is happening today. And one of the lessons that we have learned post-Gujarat is that the law in India, because at that time, post-partition, the legal safeguards were not that much in place. But now we do have the law, but the law in India is in no way equal, for example, to mass rape or rape as a weapon of war, which it doesn't even recognize. And that's the battle now for feminists, trying to get the law to change, to accept that. Okay. I don't know if I've answered your question, because there's no simple, easy answer to it, really.
Okay, and the final question here, because Urvashi is going to be available for book sales and signing books as well.
I'm not selling them. Suresh is selling them.
Suresh? Pardon me? 2 more? Okay, we can take more. I'm happy to stay here all night.
Thanks. I just wanted to, first of all, start by saying thank you. It was a very interesting talk, and there's a significant amount of the Indian diaspora in BC that was directly impacted by a partition. Both of my parents' families were impacted. My father was 4 years old when the family walked over into the Indian side. My mother was born after partition, but the family moved over during that time. But I'm wondering, in the course of your research, I haven't had an opportunity to read your book yet, but if you also looked at the partition of Kashmir.
I don't actually, not in my book. But I did do that later a little bit in a book on Kashmir that I did. But I sort of limited myself to Punjab, mainly because I'm a Punjabi, I have the language. And also because I was doing this book, I sort of researched it over a 10-year period. I had no money to do it. I didn't have a grant. One of the things I always say is that because I'm not a historian by discipline, because I'm not in any university, doing this research was a tremendously liberating experience because I could approach it from many disciplinary perspectives. I wasn't answerable for a 10-year job somewhere, or I didn't have to be answerable to a professor who would say, this is not ethnographic or this is not XYZ. So as a result of that, the book is now I've lost track of the question you asked. Oh, shit, yeah.
Kashmir was the question.
Kashmir, yes. So as a result of that, and also because I didn't have any money, I wasn't really able to travel to Kashmir. I later put together a book on Kashmir in which I address some of these issues. But there has been some very, very interesting work on Kashmir, on the partition, on both sides. There's a man called Andrew Whitehead who wrote a book called Mission Kashmir, which looks at the role of Christians in Kashmir during the partition and during the raiders' attack. And there is, on the Pakistan side, there's a wonderful man called Ahmad Salim, who works with the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Islamabad. And Ahmad Salim has done some incredible research, really detailed, really meticulous, on the role of minorities on the Pakistan side during partition, and particularly also addressing Kashmir. Unfortunately, he's very modest. He doesn't put his work together. He only publishes it in the NGO, in their monographs and things. So it's not out in the public world. But if you look up their website, you'll find it there. It's really interesting work.
Okay, is there one more question in the audience? Over here?
Okay, so
You've got a long
actually,
walk.
I have a question, if I may. Just want to
Okay,
hog, and I will
Suresh,
give
and
you
then we'll go
that
to you.
question too. Urvashi, I just wanted to, I mean, since you talk about this person who hasn't published a book but has done amazing work, I do know that one of the other things we all respect you for is your publishing work. And I think in all the voices that you have brought out through that. So could you tell us a little bit about your vision for publishing and what you've done, maybe some of the highlights that you see?
This is like telling a whole life story again. Okay, well, I mean, for those of you who don't know, I'm basically a feminist publisher. And 28 years ago, I started along with a colleague, the first feminist publishing house in India called Kali for Women, which in 19 years later had 2 children. One of which I own or I run in 2 publishing houses, 2 offspring, called, the one I run is called Zuban, which means literally tongue and voice and speech and language and things like that. And when women speak too much, it's said that their Zuban has opened up, which is what we are all about, actually. And we publish, books are by nature limited, as you know, to those who can read, those who can afford to buy, those who have access to bookshops, etc. We have a further limitation. We publish in English. Much of our work is published in English. While I'm aware of all of that, one of the things that's been very, very important to us is to publish not the traditional market stuff, but to publish the voices of women on the margins of society, even if they can't write, to work with them, to encourage them to write, and to bring these voices to public attention. And we do that a lot, which means, of course, and the process of being a feminist publisher then means you're constantly balancing your politics with trying to be sustainable and trying to survive. So far, we have been very lucky, and these women's voices that we have published have actually functioned quite well in the market and have opened up an area for Indian publishing which didn't otherwise exist. I don't know how long we'll continue to be that, because the success is premised on the labor of women who are politically committed, but to whom we are not able to pay market wages, and they all have families to bring up. And this is the problem I'm confronted with now as a publisher whose politics are very, very important to her and to all her colleagues. And I have this very strong belief that feminist publishing can survive and survive well in the commercial marketplace. So I'm about to make this leap into the commercial marketplace, but I don't know if I'll succeed. And if I don't succeed, I don't know what will happen. But anyway, the thing is that feminist publishing has survived in India 28 years so far. I think we're good for another 5-6 years at least. It's longer than in most places in the world. So let's keep our fingers crossed. If you send good vibes my way, I'll carry them with me and hope that that'll keep us going.
Yeah, and I'll talk about...
I have copies of my catalog, only 2 or 3, but you can take a look at them. This is our logo, which I love, Imagine saying you love your own logo, but I do.
This is a book that Urvashi published called A Life Less Ordinary by Baby Halder. And it's really remarkable in that it's a story of a domestic worker. They're called maids in India, and no maid in India had ever written a book before. Urvashi translated it, and it told the story of a domestic worker in India, and it became a bestseller. It was published in all the different regional languages, and it's quite a sensational look into a world that many of us are not familiar with. So I'd recommend it if you can get it, A Life Less Ordinary.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story about this book, which you might find interesting. Charlie, may I?
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't mind, do you, Suresh?
No, this young woman, Baby Halder, who wrote this book, she works as a domestic worker still in a house in Gurgaon near Delhi. And she had a really terrible life. She was married at the age of 12. She was a mother by the time she was 13. Her family life with her parents was really difficult. She was pulled out of school. And then her husband was extremely violent towards her. She had 3 children in quick succession. By the time she had the 3rd child, she decided she couldn't take this anymore, and she decided to leave. It's an amazing decision for somebody to take who's not educated, who's got 3 kids, who's got no money. She got onto a train and she found her way to Delhi with a scrap of paper on which she had an address, which was her brother's address, but not a full address. And she managed to come to Delhi and find this brother of hers, who was not happy to have her with him, but being her family member, could not reject her, kept her with him. She lived there until she found a job as a domestic worker. After 2 or 3 tries, which were terrible jobs, and she was badly treated, she found a job in the house of a man who's the son of one of India's best-known writers called Premchand. And this man noticed that when baby would be cleaning his house, she would pay a lot of attention to the room which was his library. So one day he happened upon her while she was doing that, and he saw her with a book open in her hands, and he said to her, "Can you read the title of this book? Do you know how to read?" And in fear and trepidation, because no employer had till then talked to her or even noticed her, she had been completely invisible. She read the title of the book. He realized that. They had a conversation, and he started to give her books to read, and she would finish her work and late at night sit and read books. And one day he gave her a pen and a notebook, and she said, "What's this for?" And he said, "Well, do what you like, write your life." And she wrote her life, and it became, it did quite well, but not that brilliantly. And then I heard about it from somewhere, and I went to find her, and we translated the book and published it. And it just sort of, and the new phrase, it went viral. It did really well in English, and that's very telling, because she wrote the book and it was in Hindi and it did well in Hindi, but nobody gave a damn. Because the Indian market, English is the language of privilege. So when we published it, it did really well. And I just wanted to tell you this story for that particular comment on that. Then it sold to many countries abroad. We earned more money from this one book than we have ever earned from any other book. It changed baby's life because she now had money to bring her children up, even though she continues to work as a domestic worker because she has a strong sense of loyalty to her employer. It changed our life because we got a lot of money as a publishing house. And to me, it's a delicious irony that a poor woman's story can change our life. And then we had another very interesting experience with this book, which was that it got picked up by an American publisher, it got picked up by an Australian publisher, French, Italian, etc., etc. The British publisher, who was interested in it, said, could I give him a copy of the book? This was a man from Little Brown. And I gave him the book, and he read it, and he wrote me saying, Urvashi, I like the book, but these misery memoirs, it's not miserable enough for us. And I asked him why, and this is also very telling. The tone in which Baby describes the violence that she faces is very routine, very flat, because for a poor woman for whom violence is a daily reality, there's nothing extraordinary about it. And he said, it's not melodramatic enough. And I thought, boy, you need to learn something, So I was so glad he didn't publish the book, because I wouldn't have wanted it with him.
Well, thank you for that story. And the final question on the right here.
Well, I had the opportunity to read your book as a part of my master's thesis, so it's been an absolute pleasure to be here and to listen to you speak about this topic. I have a ton of questions as a result, but I guess I'll limit to one for the sake of the audience and for time.
You could slip in 2 in one question.
Yeah. I guess you spoke about the idea of unfinished histories, and I'd like to, grapple with that some further. Those of us who study partition or have studied partition understand the extent to which that history still remains unfinished. And with 65 years having gone by, with those of whom have, adult memories of that period slowly passing on, do you sense any urgency within those who study partition, who look at partition within India, to rush to finish that unfinished history and to grapple with that idea of partition and that dislocation and so forth?
Shall you repeat the last bit?
The question was, is there a rush to complete the history, you know, as the people are dying off who experienced it? And is there a sense of urgency about preserving the history?
There is
Is
a
that
sense
correct?
of, there is a sense of urgency. Also, I think as people are getting older, they want to talk more. So that initial reluctance about speaking out has opened up also because I think people feel that there is a desire to listen. But, you know, no matter how large or how vast this sense of urgency is, the research of 20, 30, 100 people cannot in any way adequately map the experience of 14 million people. Do you see what I mean? So unless this is done at a huge scale, which can only be done by the state, which raises a whole other set of problems, the bulk of this history will be lost to us. And I think that it's really important to recover what we can, and I think most scholars who are working on this realize that. So there is a kind of hurry in which they are now trying to talk to people in all three countries and in the diaspora.
Well,
does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I want to thank Urvashi Butalia for a marvelous evening, and another reason why Indian Summer is perhaps my favorite festival. and thank Laura Bispalco and Suresh Rao, who are the organizers of the festival, along with Teamwork Productions. And I'd like to thank Roland Lorimer and SFU Publishing and SFU Woodwards. I'm Joe Hall. And if I'm missing anyone, Suresh, you can add to the list. But I want to thank everyone for coming out and hearing Urvashi. We have lots of choices on such beautiful, beautiful days, and I think most of us or all of us would agree we made the right choice tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. Now, Suresh, can you...
Charlie, Urvashi, really, it's my honor to have you here. I wish you would stay longer, but happily, I think, I just heard that UBC have invited you back in October, so... The only person really left to thank is Charlie.
Yeah,
and
Charlie,
I think I've always appreciated Charlie's skill as a moderator in teasing out the story, but always stepping back. And it's an honor to have you again. And for all your support and warm words about the festival, really, it means a lot. So thank you for that. I'm sure that people do want to continue the conversation with Urvashi. I'm sure some of you would like to get copies of her book and get her to sign it, and we will do so on the lobby level, which is 2 floors above us, where you entered the building. The books are there on display, so please join us all upstairs and we can continue the conversation there. The other thing I wanted to let you know is that in about 10 minutes, we kick off another one of our events, almost our closing event, in the W2 Media Cafe. In the basement is a sort of nightclub space where we tonight have spoken word artists, musicians, DJs, poets, jamming with each other in a series of little sets. So you will have Shanice Jan Mohammed, an Ismaili spoken word poet who does Ghalib's poetry like rap. You'll have the sitarist Mohammad Asani on the electric sitar, First Nation storyteller Chris Bose, and digital projections and Indian tribal beats fused with First Nation beats. So I'm being very complex. Basically what I'm saying is come and join us if you will. There will be food and drink too, and I hope, Urvashi, that you will spend some time looking at that as well with us.
Of course.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.